With aged care costs going up and pensioners being asked to pay more out of their own pocket, a lot of people are starting to ask, how do I actually afford to stay in my own home? Which is prompting the next question, can I tap into the value in my house without having to sell up the lot? Let's talk about that. Hey folks, I'm Jim Moranis. I run an organisation called VillageLocal, and we help older people across the country and family caregivers navigate the complexities of the aged care system. And today we're going to be looking at something that honestly doesn't get talked about enough, but it can make a huge difference for older people across the country who are trying to stay independent and well supported in their own home. Now, just before we get into this particular video, quick disclaimer, okay? I am not a financial advisor. I don't pretend to be a finance expert on the internet, and what I'm going to be covering in this video is not financial advice. I'm just here to explain how some of these things I'm going to be talking about today, how they work, and try to break them down into simple language that the normal person can understand, so that when you do sit down with a financial advisor, you're empowered to ask the right questions. Sound good? All right, let's get into it. So, why are we even talking about this? Well, aged care is getting more expensive, especially if you're a pensioner. So, for a lot of older people who are wanting to stay living well and independent in their home, the big question becomes, where do I get the extra money? And many in the community are starting to think the answer lies in tapping into the value in the family home. So when I say value, what I'm talking about is the equity in the home. And let me break that down. The equity is simply the value of the house minus any debt leaves the equity. And the idea of unlocking equity is simply just another way of saying, can I get access to some of that money right now and without having to sell the property? All right. So let's start with the most well-known and probably the most misunderstood version of tapping into that equity or process for tapping into that equity. That's with an offering known as a reverse mortgage. Now, before we get too far into this, I want to introduce you to somebody by the name of Carol Russell. Carol's got a background in finance. She's also a member of our VillageLocal Community Hub. And I caught up with her a few weeks ago so that she could give us a little bit more insight into how reverse mortgages work and as well as what are the other ways people can tap into their equity. Someone who's never heard of a reverse mortgage, how would you simply explain how it works?
You know what, Jim? I actually prefer to call them equity release loans.
Okay.
That simply explains it so much nicer, I think.
Yep.
Because it tells it as it is, you know. You are taking back some of the equity that you own in your home.
And I really like that framing, taking back some of the equity you already own. And that's exactly what a reverse mortgage or a equity release loan is. It lets you borrow against your home without having to make regular repayments. Instead, the loan plus interest gets repaid when you eventually sell the home or when you pass away. Now let's look at the pros and cons real quick. So, looking at the reverse mortgage pros. Firstly, you get to stay in your home. Then there's the fact that there's no regular repayments. Another advantage, you can get a sizable lump sum, and with that you can produce an income stream or just use it as a redraw facility whenever you need it. There's the other advantage that you still actually own your home. And the other big thing to consider is it is heavily regulated. And for these types of financial instruments, the government mandates a no negative equity guarantee, meaning that you never have to repay more than what the value of your home is ever going to be.
It is in writing. It's a definite guarantee from the lenders that the family will never ever end up owing more than the value of the property. It's in writing. They can't. It's law.
But like most things, there's also a downside, and it's important to consider this. Take a look at some of the cons associated with the reverse mortgage. First thing to consider, the interest on the loan that you've taken out against your home, well, that interest is compounded and therefore the debt will grow over time.
The borrowed money does have interest on it, charged on it, and the interest does compound. So if they take out their $100,000 this year, and then 10 or 15 years later, that debt might be $200,000.
No.
That's still the debt that needs to be repaid.
Second thing to consider is the interest rate that you're going to get on a reverse mortgage is typically a little bit higher than what a standard home loan mortgage that banks offer these days. Third thing to consider, it's going to reduce the actual value of your estate or an inheritance that you want to pass on to somebody. And another thing to consider, it's not a great way to gift money to somebody if that's what you're thinking about doing. The biggest reason for it is because any money you give away, well, you're going to have to pay interest on that money that you've given away. Let's take a look at a work example of a reverse mortgage. Okay, so let's say, again, your house is worth $800,000. You don't have a mortgage. And let's say you're able to access 20% of the equity that you have. Now, how much of the equity you can tap into, that does depend on your age. So getting back to the example, once you draw out, you're not going to make any repayments on it. However, that's going to attract an interest rate of, let's say, 7%. And that interest rate is going to be compounded, meaning the interest will attract interest on top of that. So, as I mentioned earlier, the debt that you take out, by the time you have to repay it, it's actually going to be more than the original money that you withdrew. And let's say you took that debt out over a 10-year period, then 10 years later, the house was sold. Well, that debt that needs to be repaid, and that's what happens when the house gets sold, that's when the debt gets repaid. That debt might be as high as $330,000 because, again, of the interest that has compounded over time. And that's why these loans can be great on a short-term basis, but for longer periods of time, you want to have a good plan and strategy in place to make sure you've got the best tool for the job. Now, I know that's a lot to take in. So if you want to go back over this or pass it on to somebody in the family or some friends, we've actually included a full breakdown of this topic in our latest version of our Senior Services Guide. In there, you'll find a section on how to tap into home equity without selling up. So use the link in the description below to get your free copy of the Senior Services Guide. Put in your details and we'll send it straight to your inbox. All right, let's move on to the next way to tap into the equity in your home. And this next option, it's a government-backed option, and it's known as the Home Equity Access Scheme. And it basically lets you draw a small, regular income from your home equity. So this could typically be in the range of $200 to $500 a fortnight. And it's designed to complement or top up what you're getting as a pensioner, all without having to sell your home. And you can access this program through Centrelink. So like what we did with reverse mortgages, let's talk about some of the pros and cons with the Home Equity Access Scheme. So first of all, one of the pros, it's government backed, which means that you're not actually borrowing money from a private institution or a bank or a lender. You're borrowing it from the government. So some can perceive that as being a little bit more stable than if you're borrowing privately. Second thing that's worth mentioning is the interest rate on the Home Equity Access Scheme is currently at 3.95%, which is a lot less than what you would find in the private market if you're going through a reverse mortgage. Like the reverse mortgage, no repayments are required, and payback of the loan only takes place once the house is sold. It's relatively easy to do that. Now let's look at some of the negatives compared to a reverse mortgage. Well, the first big consideration is you can't get a lump sum payment like you can with the reverse mortgage. So that does take away a lot of the flexibility about how you can actually use this type of equity release. Other disadvantages, to actually get it set up in the first place, it can take a little bit of time and a little bit of complexity. Third consideration is interest is still incurring and still compounds, like it did in the reverse mortgage phase, but at a lower interest rate. And because it's a debt, like the reverse mortgage, it is going to reduce the amount of inheritance or value of your estate. So for further clarification, let's work at an example of this one. So you've got the house, it's worth $800,000, there's no debt, and let's say you decide to draw $500 per fortnight, which would equate to about $13,000 per year. Now, with interest, which is currently at 3.95%, but that could change over time, that loan of $13,000 a year could go from $130,000, 10 times $13,000 a year, could grow because of compounding to upwards of $160,000 to $180,000. Again, because of the compounding effect of interest. So home equity access schemes Not great for big lump sum purchases because you can't get a big lump sum out, but it could be a really good option if you just wanted to top up your pension so that you could put it towards additional care support services or any other additional lifestyle funding that you needed. Now, the third way to access equity in the home that we're going to be covering in this video is a thing called a home reversion scheme. With the home reversion scheme, it's a little bit different. The home reversion scheme, you're not actually borrowing money, but rather you're selling a percentage of your home to a third party. And in return, they're going to give you a lump sum for the sale of that percentage of your home. So because it's not a loan, there's no interest associated with it, and there's no repayments that you have to make or compounding interest associated with those repayments that you'll have to make. But there's a catch, and I'll explain that catch in the form of an example. Let's go back to that $800,000 house. So let's say that you sold 25% of that $800,000 house to an organization that was willing to buy it. And for that, they gave you $200,000. Now, then let's say that over 10 years, that property price doubled in value, which isn't too far of a stretch of imagination. I mean, property prices have typically doubled over a 7 to 10 year period in Australia. So let's say over 10 years, the property price doubled and it was now worth 1.6 million for that property. Now, the original sale lump sum payment that a person would have received was the $200,000. But 10 years later, the property gets sold for $1.6 million. And after the property's sold, that third party, they are owed $400,000. The reason why is because they bought 25% of your property when it was worth $200,000. 25% was worth $200,000. Over time, that has doubled in value. And therefore, that $200,000 investment that they made is now worth $400,000. So when the property gets sold, the estate gets 1.6 million minus the 400,000, which is equal to $1.2 million. So now I've covered these three different ways to tap into the equity of the home. I want to draw out a common factor between all of them. And that is, in each scenario, you are reducing the amount of value of your overall estate or the inheritance that you will essentially pass on. And for many, this can really be the elephant in the room. This topic of tapping into your equity in your home, why is it such a taboo topic, first of all? Mm-hmm. And second of all, do you think it's got something to do with the risks that people perceive going down this path?
I think it has got to do with the risks, but it's also got to do with this idea that we've got to leave an inheritance for the kids. The mum and dad have raised the kids, they've educated the kids, they've probably already given them some money to buy their first house. For God's sake, let the kids go on their own now and let mum and dad have a quality of life with the money that they take out.
And this is really what it's all about, right? These aren't decisions to rush into. But if you're facing rising care costs and you've got all this equity tied up in your home, it might just be worth exploring. Because at the end of the day, having more choice over your care and enjoying life a little more, that's something most of us would want for our parents or ourselves. Okay, if you want to go back through all of this, it's all available in the current version of the Senior Services Guide. You can use a link in the description below to access that. So what do you think? Is it about time we started talking about how to access equity in the home, especially if you want to put it towards the supporting yourself to live independently and well in your home, in your community for as long as possible? If you're somebody that's gone down this path, love to hear about your experiences, what led you down to the certain decision that you made. Put it in the comments section below. If it's something that you've always dismissed and you've got strong thoughts as to why it's not suitable for your situation, share it with others. Maybe you can challenge their thinking. And you know, it always surprises me when I look at the analytics. I see a lot of people watching our videos and also a lot of people who aren't yet subscribed. So you know what that means? It means you're missing out for those who aren't subscribed, because every time we release a new video, those who get subscribed get notified. So if you haven't already done it, make sure you hit that subscribe button just over there. Until next time, catch you in the next one.